And it's 5 past. Right. Well, that will do. So over to you, Andy.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is the fourth lecture on volume three, and it's probably in terms of what I have to contribute, the nodal point of what I have to say, certainly for the first first parts one, two, and three. Okay, so we're going to be looking at chapters 8 and 9 on the general rate of profit. And I'll just give you an overview. We're moving from obviously from part one to part two. The big issue is the move from a level of abstraction, certainly in the first three chapters at the level of the individual capital. And Marx is then does extend the sort of the scope quite broadly in chapters 5 and 6. But analytically, if you like, he's going to change from individual capital to the social totality. And we'll talk a bit about that. These two chapters are very widely discussed in the literature, lots of interpretations, especially about what's known as the transformation problem or transformation solution, which we'll definitely talk quite a lot about. I have a take on it. My interpretation has 4 points of precision. The first and probably the most important, which again I'll expand on and explain, is the transformation is not really from value as it's normally understood. It's from simple exchange value. Uh, Most of the interpreters take it to be from simple exchange value. And my argument is it's not actually the real starting point. The simple exchange value is a hypothetical alternative, and that really the transformation is from the substance of value to the form of value. The A lot of the literature gets mixed up between capital consumed and capital advanced, and this concerns how the rate of profit is measured. Um, these two are quite linked to the second point of precision. We need to distinguish between turnover of an entire capital and not just the circulating component. Marx says that in his chapter 9 solution, he makes the turnover the same in the different sectors of production, which is true for circulating capital, but it's not true for the entire capital, because that also includes the circulation of fixed capital. So I'll touch on that again. And lastly, when Marx writes about the organic composition of capital, that really stems from the relations within productive capital, as distinct from, say, the money capital or the commodity capital. And I've got three proposals. The first is I'm going to argue how actually capitalism or capitals, individual companies, if you like, actually come to selling their commodities at prices of production. I argue that the solution that Marx offers need to be deepened to include socially necessary labour time. And I also think that it needs to be widened beyond what he presents in terms of differentiation by organic compositions of capital to include different rates of surplus value. So I'm also effectively going to argue my interpretation. Um, Now, this just explains a bit more fully what I've already noted. Part one is focused on the individual capital. And I think that Beverly Best deals with this quite well. She explains that there is a qualitative difference between surplus value and profit form, which is that in the profit form, the substance of surplus value, that is surplus labor, disappears. So even though they're quantitatively can be the same, there's a qualitative difference, even though the amounts can be the same, right? And we discuss this quite a lot. There's a valorization process, which is the process of generating surplus value. Um, but it's a sort of a double process, right? Because it's on the one hand capital valorizing itself, which is what you see in the profit form side, but it's also capital is valorized by the appropriation of surplus value, which is where the class relation comes in. And what Beverly Best writes is the substance and magnitude of surplus value and profit are identical. Now, I have put a question mark over substance because I think it's quite an interesting discussion. Um, is the substance of surplus value, which is the same as the substance of profit? Well, they're certainly their money amounts are the same at this level, and quite rightly, the generator of distinction in these early chapters is that the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit have to be different, and this comes from Marx, of course. So what we get from chapters 1 to 3 is that the capitalist sees cost price as the basis of value, and they seek to get a profit over and above that. Um, Now, if you like, subjectively, or the way it appears to capital, have we already lost the substance of labor? I mean, on the side of valorization from the perspective of capital, there is no real content to the profit connected with surplus labor, even though there is in reality. So what you've got is a dual reality running all the way through this. Now, Mark, if you just read chapters 1 to 3, you might tilt towards that direction. But then Marx, as he so often does, brings back in living labor. And you can't ignore living labor. It's quite clear there's an objective class relation which is generating the profits, which are being viewed as being separate from surplus labor. So Marx brings in, not only bring in living labor, in these chapters, he actually returns to the theme of alienation of the working class within capitalist social relations. And he actually writes about it in terms of the alienation of the collective worker. I actually think this is quite an important theme, right? And I'll mention this again because it's not only now abstract labor, but in a sense, we're moving towards some sort of sense of abstract capital as well. What is capital in its totality? And so, what we're going to do now is in part 2, follow Marx's argument where the magnitude of surplus value and profit diverge. Okay. In part 1, they don't diverge because we're at the level of the individual capital. And the reason that surplus value and profit will diverge at an individual capital is that the rates of profit will equalize. And this is a real sort of fundamental tension or contradiction in what Marx is writing about. So what we're looking at is how the essence really appears as profit. In part 1, it's possible for them to diverge because the capitalist could sell his commodities, their commodities at a price which is not the same as value. That's possible for them. In part 2, they must diverge. There's a sort of a law-like logic to their divergence. Now, insofar as this is actually a general
General
law,
law.
I've got the
I've
echo,
got
and I
the
don't know
echo.
why.
I don't know why.
Insofar as this is a general law, the rate of profit is more than just an average. Of course, one can calculate the average of all the capital's profits and add them all up and subtract and divide and so on. But this is more. This is more than that. This is actually, it impinges on reality. The actual reality of real operating capitals have to have some mechanism by which they relate to the general rate of profit. It has to serve, even if all capitals aren't actually directly equalized, it is the norm against which they operate. Now, surplus value, Marx will argue, despite the fact that the surplus value is different in different sectors, this norm operates and impinges itself upon them, right? So, surplus labor is the source of profit, but it is not represented in direct proportion. This is basically the nub of my argument. And what this means is the relation between value, or if you like, the substance of value, and exchange value becomes more complicated with the capitalist social relation. What Marx writes, and again, this is something which is quite important in the interpretive literature, is that part 2 is dealing with a totality. We've seen totality before in volumes 1 and volume 2. Marx moves in a general pattern from the individual to the totality in each of the volumes. This perspective of totality is different to the perspective in volumes one and two. He's looking at how circulation and production concretely combine in a system of competing capitals. It's quite an important concept here. So what we're talking about is competition. So the totality is not just a simple aggregation. The totality is a live process of competition, right? But there is an actual question here, right? If capitals are in different sectors, how can individual capitals compete with each other? How can the manufacturer of cotton yarn, for example, compete with the manufacturer of locomotives? Of course, I mean, they're not competing in the same commodity markets. So we've got in volume three, as distinct really from volume one, which deals with intra-sector competition. We've got capitals in different sectors, inter-sector competition. So how can we make sense of intersector competition, right? By what index can different sector capitals actually be competing with each other? What are they competing over? Now, it's clear in intra-sector competition, it's about the price and quality of the commodity. So the capitalists who produce more commodities more cheaply are going to get bigger share of the market. They're competing with the other capitals. Intersector competition, the capitals are actually competing over profitability. And that is to say that the profit rate is actually the index around which it's not the price of the commodity, it's the degree of profit that's the index of competition. So what are they competing for? They're actually competing for money capital as investment in their business. Okay, so those businesses with a higher rate of profit are going to attract more investment, capital advanced in Marx's terms, right? So intersector competition is not directly in commodity markets. So of course, commodity markets, how capitalists perform in commodity markets is going to then become how profitable they are. But in terms of their competition across different sectors, they're competing in capital markets to attract capital, basically. Okay. In chapters 8 and 9, what we have is a subdivision of the whole of the capitalist system into different sectors, industrial sectors, basically, structured according to different organic compositions of capital. Once again, the locomotive manufacturers, the cotton spinners, the agricultural capitalists, so on and so forth, different sectors of this industry. So, and this way of splitting it up is not the same, for example, as by different rates of surplus value. It's assumed that they're all working at the same rate of surplus value. So something's been lost in transition. What's been lost in transition from volume 3, part 1 to part 2 is one and a half of the three variables that Marx very clearly establishes in part 1, that the conversion of the surplus value to the profit, the rate of surplus value to the rate of profit, depends on three variables. One is the organic composition, two is the turnover time, and three is the rate of surplus value. What Marx does in part 2 of volume 3 is he keeps the rate of surplus value the same, doesn't examine that as a degree of variation, and he semi keeps turnover as the same. So his main concern is to see what the effect of different organic compositions. That's the principal variable. Different industries, different organic compositions of capital. And this is actually a slightly old slide. And I wrote here organic composition of total capital advanced. I'm going to explain that's true only if capital advance is the same as capital applied. We'll come back to that one. The big point here is the following. You will remember that the rate of profit, as Marx writes in part 1, is S over C, and it's got two major variables. One is rate of surplus value, S over V, and the second is an expression of value composition in the form of variable capital over the total capital advanced. In part 2, what's happened to S over V? Well, he's writing about capitalism in one country. And he doesn't really see this as methodologically problematic. He thinks extending it to many countries shouldn't cause a big problem, which actually is not true in today's world, certainly. So at best, this is the first cut. It's only half the solution. It's a provisional take on the totality. And there needs to be what I call a widening of the solution to include different rates of surplus value. There's a tendency to treat the solution to this problem as in an overly technical and quantitative way, and in particular, and especially if you like, obscuring living labor as the substance of profits, profit form. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is sort of use a few diagrams as I go through. This diagram is sort of like a template to get to demonstrate what I'm getting at, right? So you've got a sector, industrial sector, which is involving variable capital. The variable capital used up in producing an annual product, the commodities over a year produced in that sector. We have living labor being set in motion. We have a new value being created, of which part of which is surplus value. We have fixed capital being used and being used up, and we have circulating content capital, okay, which is all used up. That's the raw materials, basically. And what I put in here is that the living labor becomes, we're talking about time becoming money, okay? Time is represented by money in the commodity form. So we've got the process of production, which is the red circle, the living labor, is represented in a new exchange value of the commodities produced. And this is the basic concept that I'm going to sort of elaborate upon. So I hope this basic diagram works. If it doesn't, we're going to have a problem. I hope it does. So the labor time is itself subdivided between the necessary labor time to repay the workers and the surplus labor time, which is represented as surplus value. So you can see the whole of the labor time is represented as all the new exchange value, and the surplus labor time is represented as the surplus value. Okay. Oh yes, I just added depreciation of fixed capital there, a late entry onto the diagram. Okay. Now I'm going to take a sidebar here about methodology, because if you remember or go back to or even look for the first time, the introduction to the Grundrisse, Marx spells out an approach which involves the difference between how the concrete occurs in reality and how it occurs in thought. By by which he means that when a concrete reality is being theorized and theoretically explained, it proceeds, or the scientific method, as he puts it, proceeds from a series of transitions from abstract to the concrete. The concrete comes more and more closer to a reproduction of the reality, but it's still a reproduction in thought of the reality. It's not itself reality. Now, broadly speaking, I think Marx follows this methodology in the exposition of Capital. Broadly speaking, he starts from a simple commodity circulation to capitalist industrial commodity production and circulation, which is more complex, involves more planes of abstraction combining together. For example, I mean, in a simple commodity production, as he presents it, you have the laborer who's also the owner of the commodity, with analytically no class distinction involved. Whereas with capitalist production, of course, there is a class relation in the labor process, in the production process. Now, he starts off with simple exchange values being proportionate to the socially necessary labor time. And this continues for a long way through Capital, right? And the principle behind this, of course, is the equality of labor. Abstract socially necessary labor time is the determinant of exchange values of commodities. he sometimes says this more or less explicitly. He sometimes sort of says, well, okay, it's fundamentally regulated rather than directly proportionate, which is sort of an implicit qualification. And sometimes he does point explicitly to, well, things are actually a bit different. And in volume one, there are a few pointers to volume three. But basically, it would only be by coincidence that the simple value view of commodities is true in a capitalist society. And that would be if the organic composition of an industry is the same as the social average, right? That's a very specific and coincidental circumstance. Okay, so in volume one and volume two, this is the crunch point, right? That Marx makes no significant distinction between surplus value and profit. Profit is the realized surplus value, he will say. But now we're getting further on and quite deep, quite late into the exposition. And rather than simply the laws of value or the laws of surplus value, Marx is now taking us to the laws of profit, the laws of profit formation. And this is absolutely crucial to a fundamental comprehension of the way the capitalist mode of production really works, how it really is. But this is getting closer to a concrete explanation. But with what we've had up to this point is a slightly simplified version being presented. Now, why is this important? It's because we can come quite attached to the simplified version and see the late edition as sort of like an aberration. But I view it differently. I think this is to do with this question of moving from abstract to concrete and reconstructing plane by plane, step by step, level by level, perspective by perspective, the real situation of the capitalist mode of production. Okay, so what we've got, and the reason I'm saying this not only in general, but this is very important in terms of my interpretation of what happens between chapters 8 and 9, right? I slightly deconstruct the transition from chapters 8 to 9, right? The formation of the general rate of profit is not the same as the equalization of prior, real, independently formed sector profit rates when they are all proportionate to socially necessary labor time. And that's strongly implied by the way chapters 8 and 9 are written. In other words, we've got a starting point where commodities are regulated at exchange values which are proportionate to their labor times. And we've got an end point where they're not. And I think this is a misreading of what's actually going on. And so it can lead to confusion. And there has been an awful lot of confusion about this. And so it's not surprising that people are still arguing about it. But the fundamental issue is to be able to distinguish between what happens in reality and how that complex reality is reconstructed step by step in thought. So what I'm saying is Marx is reconstructing in thought a movement, but it's not the same as what happens in reality. Okay, although we start with chapter 8, I'm going to use an illustration from chapter 9 because it's going to get quicker to our real content. So this diagram is at the beginning of chapter 9, and what Marx is showing here is that you've got different value compositions of different sectors of production, different organic compositions, with the same rates of surplus value and with the same turnovers of circulating capital, then the amount of variable capital invested will buy a certain amount of labor power. And so long as the surplus value rate is the same in the different sectors, this is an index of how much living labor has been set in motion by those capitalists, right? And what is clear is that the labor intensive sectors, the workers are producing more value because there's more of them and more surplus value relative to the capital advance. So if you compare, I don't know if I've got stars on this, if you compare chapter capital 3, there's 8 times more workers in a set to work in a capitalist exploitation situation than there is in sector 5. And so they're producing a surplus value of 40 whereas the workers in sector 5, there's just less of them. They're producing a surplus value of 5. So if you think of the value of the product produced, and then you think of the rate of profit as the surplus value, this 20, 30, 40, 15, 5, over the capital's advance, and all of those are 100. Okay, so these are very simple numbers. It would seem that the workers in capital 3 are producing more profit per the 100 invested than the workers in sector 5. Okay, so this is, if you like, the the starting point, but is it a real starting point or is it just a counterfactual? Okay, I say it's a counterfactual. Okay, because it doesn't really happen like that. And Marx says this even from volume 1. He says, well, we all know this doesn't really happen. So what does happen? But why is it that this doesn't happen as well? I mean, why isn't this actually true? So back to my diagram. Now we've got 5 sectors, 5 different sectors. So I've taken Marx's schema and I've just shown it diagrammatically. I hope you can follow this. So we've got these 5 different sectors, all with different amounts of composition between the constant capital and the variable capital. So different amounts of new labor, new value being added, different amounts of surplus value being generated. Okay. So, okay, so what we've got here is different amounts of new value being created. This is the presumed starting point. Okay, in chapter 8. And then what we add on from chapter 9 is a common equalized general rate of profit. So whatever the particular conditions of each sector are, there's an average rate of profit which is imposed, if you like, under conditions of equalization to all the different sectors. So, and every amount of capital, as long as it's the same, whether it's invested in sector 1 or sector 5 or sector 3, the capitalists are going to yield from the sale of their commodities a similar or the same rate of profit. So these are the pressure points here. You can see that in each case, the surplus value is either a bit less or a bit more, or sometimes by coincidence the same as they would be as the rate of profit. So this is the profit is different to the surplus value in each sector. Okay. But how do we move from one to the other? Okay. So I'll just put in these little yellow things to show the uniformity of the idea. There's a general rate of profit no matter what each sector is producing. The capitals involved are going to get the same degree of expansion of their capital. Okay. So there's a non-identity between surplus value and profit in each of the sectors. The big question is, how does this happen? The general themes in the literature, to some limited degree, also reading from the text from Marx as well, is that there are transfers of value between these sectors. In other words, the sector here, which is a lot of workers involved, so it's a low organic composition of capital, is transferring value to the sector adjacent to it, their neighbor, where there's a lot fewer workers, there's a lot more constant capital involved, and there's a transfer of value in effect from one to the other. So it's a redistribution of surplus value. The only problem with this is that no actual transactions take place. So it's kind of like a magic solution, which you can't quite see how does it really happen. I mean, it is still a puzzle. The representation of socially necessary labor time as new exchange value and surplus value as profit is different by sector. This is my argument. Okay, this is the blue bit here is me arguing my point of view. So they were never so different in the first place. So where is the point of variation? We wouldn't start from here. There's something else that's happened which has slightly been missed in this way of presenting the problem. And what I'm saying is the way that the real labor, you see these little yellow arrows, the way that labor time is represented in money is not uniform. So what we've got is an improbable explanation, but we have to discard the impossible because there are no actual transactions between sectors. So how else could it happen? So this is back to Marx's schema, and we're just adding some stuff now. This is Marx's solution. He adds up all of the surplus value. He adds up all of the capitals. And what he gets then is an average rate of profit by the total surplus value, which is 110, divided into the total capital advance, which is 500. So that yields an average rate of profit of 22%. There's one other change here, which again, a lot of commentators miss, and it's quite important actually, is that this is different to the first presentation in another respect, which he's now put in the cost price of commodities, which is not the same as the capital advance. He's saying, okay, so this capitalist sector here, they've invested 100, but the commodities they produced aren't valued at 100. They're valued in terms of the cost prices involved as 70. Okay. And this will vary from one sector to another. And so his procedure is very simple. He adds now profit, which is computed at 22%. And since each of these sectors has got a capital of 100, that's a profit of 22. And he adds the profit onto the cost price of the commodities of that sector. And then what he points out is what this means is that for the capital intensive sectors, the high organic composition sectors, sector 5 again, then the prices are much higher than they would have been if they were just set at their simple exchange values. And conversely to sector 3, they're much lower. So because the prices are regulating prices of production, he calls them, are no longer they're simple exchange values. They're no longer simply proportionate to the labor time spent in those sectors. What you've got is an equalization of the rate of profit across the sectors. It's in one level ingenious, but what it depends on, excuse me, is a separation between the concept of the substance of value and the form of its presentation into circulation. And if you compare this with simple exchange value, right, as I've just said, you can see that the high organic composition sectors have prices of production which are higher than their values and vice versa. How does it happen? How does it happen? How does it happen? This is what appears to capital. What appears to capital is we go back to this. The creation of profit is due to their effort. They now are generating commodities whose regulating price are their costs plus profit. So the contribution of labor is reduced to simply being the cost element of labor, which is the variable capital, the wages are paid to the workers. There is no conception here of the source of the profit coming from surplus labor at all. Rather, it comes from the entrepreneurs themselves. So you have a complete inversion of who is the active creator of new value, to the degree that it's no longer labor that creates new value, it's capital that creates new value. The workers adding new value disappears. There we go. So exploitation as such has just completely disappeared in this perspective. And the form of the commodity now as cost plus profit, it's a general form. All capitalist commodities take on this sort of socially constructed form. The specific contribution of labor of adding new value has in effect disappeared from view. It's still there, but it's disappeared from view. The organic composition of capital, as I've said, is relates to productive capital because it's how the means of labor and the object of labor relate to living labor. And that really means they're applied in production. Now, the organic composition of capital therefore involves all of the fixed capital because all the machines are being used, and all of the constant capital being applied. And the organic composition is really those against the variable capital being applied. Now, this can also compute to be the same as the advanced capital multiplied by the number of turnovers, right? So if the number of turnovers of circulating capital is 1, which is what Marx actually puts them to in chapter 9, what that means is not by definition, but by force of this assumption that all of the circulating capital turns over in 1 year, then what that means is that the capital applied is the same as the capital advanced. And that's a finesse by Marx. But so he's taken out the turnover of circulating capital as being a factor in the formation of the prices of production. However, I want to go back to the fact that even so, the cost prices are different in each sector. They're not the same as the capital advance in each sector. And in actual fact, although the circulating capital turnover has been put down to 1 by Marx in each case, it's not true that the overall turnover rate is the same in each case, because the overall turnover rate also includes how much fixed capital there is in relation to circulating capital. And this is still different in each sector. Okay. Now, would this matter? Well, it doesn't matter if you're measuring the rate of profit against the capital advanced, because that's, in our example, 22% doesn't change, right? But it does matter if you're measuring the rate of profit against the amount of capital that's been used up and is contained in the value of the annual commodity product, which is this C. Okay. So this turns out to be quite an important point in terms of understanding the real process of how these things work. So just to summarize here, Marx has equalized the rate of turnover of circulating capital, but he has not equalized the rate of turnover of the entire capital in each sector, because the fixed capital ratio within each sector is different. What is being transformed? The starting point in this interpretation is the essence. And the essence isn't just a substance, it's a contradiction. It's because it's labor time which is subdivided by the class relation. And to what is it being transformed into is the capitalist form of commodities, right? So that when we talk about the transformation of values to prices, I think this expresses in form how a real contradiction gets played out in the capitalist mode of production. So, in this argument, it's not the transformation from simple exchange values. They're not the real starting point, right? They're, as I say, a hypothetical counterfactual. But what we've got is how the one form of commodities plus new value becomes cost plus profit. So what we've got is a over-determining replacement of the form. The way in which labor time is represented is actually different in the capitalist mode of production. And so this is not just simply a process of one way of representing prices to another, representing labor to another. It's more a question of the relation between essence and appearance, which, as I say, is itself a contradiction, right? There is some processing element involved, and the best place to look for this is a long quote which I haven't put in, right? Because there is a movement, of course, in prices of production as well, but it's within prices of production, not to prices of production. I will talk more about this next time, I think. Just for time, I'm not going to go into this too much right now. It's available for you to look at. These are standard errors, I think, in the interpretive literature. Okay. I want to come on to 2 other points before we finish. In actual fact, the way instead of actual transactions or actual money moving around, the key point is that the way money represents labor time is different in each sector. And I'm just going to explain this one. Remember, I mentioned that although turnover of circulating capital is the same by design by Marx in each sector. The turnover of the whole capital is different in each sector. In other words, the relationship between this 100 and the capital used up is different because the capital used up is what comes back to the capitalist when the goods are sold, right? And the turnover period is longer in some of these sectors than it is in others. It takes a lot longer time for the commodity value of the goods here in sector 5 to come back up to the 100 that was originally invested. In fact, it takes over 6 years, right? And in most of the sectors, it's just over a year, basically. Okay. Now, this is the turnover period in years, the relationship between the full capital advanced and the capital contained in the annual commodity product. The markup ratio from cost to the price of production is this turnover period times the rate of profit that Marx says in some of his workings, which is taken as a given. So in other words, if we take this first one, turnover period is 1.43 years. You multiply 22% by that, and you're going to get the markup. Over the cost price, which is this one here, the 70. So if you multiply 70 by 31.46%, it's 22. Same as it's a different way of getting the same result of that actual amount of profit. And so we're sort of repeating the outcomes that Marx has already shown us, but from using a different route to get there. So the route to get there is based on cost price plus markup rather than capital advance plus rate of profit. But the result is capital advance plus rate of profit. Okay. And I think this is closer to the reality of how capitals actually do, how it actually gets equalized. This is actually how it really works. Okay. So we're getting closer to there'll be a different markup by sector. The longer the turnover period by sector, and this is incredible markup here. The markup here is, more the regulating price is 1.5 times the cost price plus times 1.5. So this pi, the life of pi we got here is significant in the way price of production are really formed, right? And it varies by sector according to the structure of capital in each sector. Okay. It could be the case that this ratio C over K, the total turnover time is 1, in which case then the rate of profit would be the same as this markup. But that's Marx does examine that in his notebooks. It doesn't get filtered into, unfortunately, into volume 3. Okay. So once again, I'm saying that the simple exchange value is a counterfactual that would have happened only if there was a direct proportion between social labor time and the way it's represented. Now, the way it's represented in Marx's solution presumes the equality of capitals is superimposed on the equality of labor. So it's the same content, but represented by a different shape. And this is a sort of an analogy to that. And this is how companies actually do it. They look at the profits and losses, basically. So I'll do this fairly quickly. This is the markup idea shown in my diagram. So each time there's a markup on costs, and the markup is different by each sector in order to get the same general rate of profit. Okay, so it's not very clear in this diagram, but these arrows are meant to be a bit different by each sector. Okay. This also relates to how capitalist firms operate. I won't, again, what's the time? I'm not going to explain this very fully. I'll just show it. But what it brings out is that there are different forms of capital. The metamorphosis idea of capital in volume 2 is actually very real when it comes to how corporations really operate. Just for example, the rate of profit idea in Marx, the closest correlate to it in business practice is the return on capital employed. This figure here is sort of like the operational capital, functioning capital, what sort of profit dividends it can generate. But then there's another thing, which is the corporation is working in commodity markets on the one hand. They're also working in capital markets, as I mentioned at the beginning, on the other. And in capital markets, what matters is a different but related measure, which is the return on investment, which is will be some kind of relationship with the return on capital employed. So the profit rates are equal, but how they're made equal is there has to be a different representation of labor time according to the weight of capital in the sector. So the general rule is internalized by each capital in terms of its own performance parameters. In other words, what would be a sector norm for markup to get the what's expected general rate of profit? Okay. So there's not a big pool somewhere that gets moved in and then moved out. It pertains in a different way, operates, it impinges in a different way. The law of competition in capital markets impinges on this in this way on each individual capital. Okay, so the sectors have, if you like, as a given, if they want to get a certain rate of profit, this will be their prices of production, and they have to adjust their costs and so on in order to accommodate that. It's that way around. I've got two more important slides. This is actually using the simpler example from chapter 9. So what I want to show here is, well, what about labor time? We're talking about labor time, but I haven't actually talked about labor time. Well, in chapter 8, Marx does work from labor time, and he shows the difference between these two compositions of capital. This is a high value composition, a lot more capital invested in constant capital. This one, a lot more capital invested in variable capital. And as we know, that means that there's more labor time in the low composition. It's slightly misleading the term, but low value composition means that there's more labor time. Okay. I've taken out the thousands, but each of these two capitals generates commodities with a certain exchange value at a certain cost. And what Marx does here, or what if we applied Marx's solution in chapter 9 to his simple example in chapter 8, this is what it would look like. In other words, the surplus value in one sector is generated as 100 from the workers. Surplus value generated in another sector is 600. Total is 700 surplus value. That's a surplus value rate of profit against the capital advanced, okay, of 700 over what have we got here? We've got surplus value over 1400. So that's a overall average rate of 50%. So what Marx does is he adds the 50% to the cost price in each sector, and then you get a selling price. But this price of production is higher in the one sector and lower in the other sector. So this is me applying Marx's chapter 9 solution to his most simple example. Now, all I'm doing here is what would this mean in terms of labor time? If you think of this, this is a value added of a variable capital plus surplus value, okay, and the deviation. So the value added here is 450. I'll say that a bit better. You can look at the cost price less the variable capital. In other words, it's just this 600, okay, which is the constant capital used up. And the new value added, which is a combination of the wages and the profits, is now 450 in this case. And that's the high organic composition capital sector. And in the low organic but high labor sector, the new value added is more, it's more than double, it's 950. So together that's 1400. But the labor time in the second sector is 6 times more than it was in the first sector. So although the value added is double, the labor time is actually 6 times less in the first sector. So the amount of value added per hour, if we think of it in terms of profit, is much higher in the high value composition capital sector. So it appears as though the workers in this sector are producing new value at a much higher rate than the workers in sector B. Okay. And similarly, and follows on, of course, if you just think of that in terms of the profit to wages ratio, so it's now P over V, not S over V. The profit per worker in the first sector is much higher than the profit per worker in the second sector, even though they're actually getting paid the same wages. And even though their rate of surplus value is actually the same, it's 100% in both cases. So what you've got is the concept of value added is a form of surplus false consciousness. It generates a false consciousness because it looks as though the workers in sector A are more exploited than the workers in sector B. They're actually being exploited to the same degree, but the equalization of profit means that there's more profit per worker in sector A than in sector B. And this is all due to the fact that their labor time, their labor is still the source of the profit. Okay. That's fundamental. It's not detached, but it's represented in a non-proportional way. It's an unequal representation of labor time. Okay. And this does lead to, we can think of some examples even of false consciousness of the workers in A could get a different idea of reality than the workers in B, even though the workers in B, it's quite astonishing, but it happens, right? So what we've got now is essence and appearance by different degrees of representation of labor time. This really accentuates it here, right? And the value added is been brought down in some sectors and pushed up in other sectors, so that when you deduct the variable capital, there's always going to be the same profit in every sector. So it's an adjustment that way around. The value added, so-called, isn't the proportionate value added, it's the value added that's required to make the rate of profit the same in each sector. Okay. I'm taking out constant capital because actually the constant capital doesn't make any difference to this. It really doesn't affect this at all. So the equality of capitals replaces the equality of labor. Now, all of this is not surplus profits. All of this is to achieve the same rate of profit proportionate to capital. So it's a relation, not a process. The analogies, the first analogy, it's a bit like Einstein's law of relativity. Light bends according to the weight of gravity, the mass of the mass which is bending, attracting light. So you're going to bend it. Well, the degree of representation of labor time bends according to the weight of the capital. But it's even more than that. It's not just that the capital bends it, it eclipses it, it gets in the way. You can't see labor as a source of light because there's this bloody great capital in the way, which is blocking the real source of the light. So it's a bendy eclipse. I don't know if any something like that actually happens, but that's what it is. So dead labor, capital puts itself in front of living labor and therefore appears in a distorted way as the source of the new value. And the other analogy I want to give, I mean, these, you think these work or not, I don't know, caused the great controversy when Bob Dylan switched from folk to electric guitar. Folk guitar is simple, it's artisan. Electric guitar is industrial, capitalist, distorting. Okay, I think that's the analogy. Of course, actually, that happened long before, but less well known. The same sort of transition happened in black music from folk to the city, from analog to electric, not analog, non-electric. Okay. The point is that the source of the sound is the same, right? It's the vibrating string, right? But the electric amplifiers change, modify how it comes out to our ears. Okay. So the sound shape is different, but it's still fundamentally the same source. Okay. So we would have to extend I'm just going to do this just one more thing, my favorite phrase, just one more thing, right? There are different rates of surplus value in the world. That's the reality. And I'll just take Marx's simple example and put in different rates of surplus value. The workers in sector B now get paid about one third of the workers in sector A. So instead of 600 variable capital, they now just get wages at 200 variable capital. This is what really happens when vacuum cleaners get moved from Gloucestershire to Malaya. Dyson famously moved his production there because workers are getting paid one third less. And what you can see is the divergence between the two sectors increases even more, basically. So the rate of surplus value is much greater. This is actually quite conservative in terms of what really happened in the world, but we'll take these figures. Okay. Cost price in sector B goes down. Also, the capital required in sector B goes down at the same time as the surplus value being generated goes up. It's a double effect. Capitalist wins both ways. But also, and for no other reason than it's part of a system, under the rules of equalization, the profits in overall go up and the profits in sector A go up. Okay, even though they haven't done anything, right? What you get is an even sharper differentiation. And it would seem that the workers in sector A are adding even more of the value added than the workers in sector B per worker, because profit per worker has gone up. And you can see here the profit wages ratios are really very different. There's 10 times more value added in sector A per worker, apparently, than there is in sectors per hour, that is rather, than in sector B. And that's when the workers go in sector B are paid one third less, but apparently they're producing 1/10 of the value added. And there's nothing to do with how much value they're actually creating. It's to do with the form of representation based on the equalization of rates of profit across capitals. So it's an even more accentuated rate of consciousness about what's going on. But the big question is where are most of the workers? In this universe, there's 6 times more workers in B than there are in A. And this last one is just an extra one, which we don't have time for now. So I think I should stop to allow time for discussion. But in this investigation, I have uncovered something about capital advanced and capital applied, which we can discuss if people want to in the discussion. But in the interest of discussion, I'll stop there.
Excellent, great. Thank you very much, Andy. That was terrific. A lot there. Right. Well, yes, we have about half an hour for questions and comments, so I'm sure you'll have some. Over to you. You could raise your hand electronically. Hopefully, I'll see it. I think I will.
I mean, I know it's a lot, and I know it needs to be written.
Well, perhaps I could just
Yeah.
get the ball rolling. Just this idea about equalization of rates of profit. I think there's probably a debate about whether this actually has an application to. I mean, Marx is talking about sectors within a sort of, let's call it a national economy. So he's not thinking in global terms. I think you made that point. So is there not a debate amongst people who talk about this issue about whether what he says about this phenomenon at the national level can be applied at the global level, whether you can actually have sort of it makes sense, or in practice is an actuality, as it were, to talk about the equalization of rates of profit at the global level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the chapters we've just been reading, chapters 5 and 6, which I really liked rereading, I have to say, there's this whole reality that he writes about raw materials being provided.
Mm.
And in chapter 6, there's a lot of detail about the cotton being provided to the industrial capitalist boom,
Mm.
right? So Marx was living in a reality which he was well aware of,
Mm.
raw materials being sucked in. And of course, to get a full theory, you'd have to include things like, agricultural rent and so on. But nonetheless, even there, if you think of the cotton, was the rate of surplus value of the workers producing the cotton or the enslaved workers
Mm.
the
Mm.
same as the workers in England, right? Well, you've got two ways of arguing it, really. One is to say, well, they weren't part of the capitalist system anyway, and they're sort of like separated in some way. Or my view, which, say, for example, William Robinson puts this view, and I agree with him on this, it was like a subsystem, right, with a different mode of exploitation. But therefore, you have to look at how, the rate of surplus value of enslaved workers. How can we explain that, right? So even in Marx's own reality, I don't think he was right about that. I think it's quite problematic, but necessary to sort of bring these in. And what I like about Marx compared to a lot of the literature, right, is he does continually remind us that when you're talking about the organic composition of capital, it's not just a fixed capital. He's saying when the social productivity of labor increases, that means there's a massive increase in the movement of raw materials. Right? Just more stuff going through. I mean, this from cotton mills and stuff, right? There's a load more cotton bales going through. So I think I just think he hadn't quite finished the job, and had he addressed it, would have solved us a lot of angst, but he didn't, poor guy, he died. So we got so far with it.
Yes, the idea of Marx not finishing the job. I didn't see this. Gives his plans he kept writing about what he wanted to do, and in which volume it was like 1/32 of the total project was actually completed in his own. So he certainly had ambition. I forgot to say, actually, it would be great if you could switch your cameras on, then we can actually have that sort of nice feel, seminar style feel. I mean, I can see quite a few of you have. So, Walter, thank you very much. You have your hand up. Over to you.
Thanks. Yes. Well, Tony's comment or question suggests what happens if the rate of profit is not equalized? And in the under imperialism, I don't think one can assume that it is. The Bangladeshi capitalists, for example, can't invest and buy out Apple or Walmart or anything like that and compete with them. Walmart can impose its own rate of profit, and Apple does so even when it's dealing with Foxconn in China. So if you take into account the factor of monopoly, that monopoly can achieve a higher rate of profit, that means that the inequality between global North and global South is even greater than in the last diagram that Andy showed.
I completely accept that. I mean, this is just building step by step, but actually the reality is exactly as Walter says. I mean, and also the reality is enforced by military power and so on. So it's a stronger connection with the reality of imperialism. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Walter. So I can't see any other hands.
Hi there.
All right. Yes, great. Go on, John.
Absolutely fascinating, and so much. Just on this particular question that Walter's just raised. Sorry, I've lost my thread. I'll just come back in a second. Sorry.
Yeah. It's a big question. I'm not surprised. It's a big question.
Yeah, no, sorry. This was the point I wanted to make. That in reality, in the concrete reality, we have to take into account all kinds of forms of monopoly and oligopsony. And so, I mean, one description of the global market, the way that small that producers in the low wage and high quantity of labour employed end of the value chain, the term race to the bottom has a great deal of force. They are forced to compete with each other between countries as well in order to get the contract for next year's production of goods. If they can't cut their costs, cut their prices even further, then they'll just move production to another supplier somewhere else. The race to the bottom concept of it, the way that the margins of the Bangladeshi garment producers is very, very thin. They can't afford to improve their factories. No provision was made to ensure that they could afford to do it in the actual deal that was eventually struck with the garment companies. So, that's in reality, this it was summarized by I think Raphael Kaplinsky as a fierce oligopsony. So, like, not a opsony is like a sort of a monopoly of buyers. The global buyers perform a crucial part in this, and that's something else we've discussed previously about how commercial capital has become dominant in the price formation in value chains. So
Yeah, I think there's a pause there. I mean, I would also add, I mean, we are trying to reconstruct the theory now. I mean, I do think that Capital 3 will help us step by step, but it's a kind of like, as we keep saying, it's a marathon, right? So the role of commercial capital, Marx has got his take on it in the next but one part, and then the banks and so on, right? And the land, all these do come in. And the really big one, which I haven't said, right? If you're moving from how far we've got so far to the reality is the question of national currencies, and the fact what about the money? We're no longer talking about simple money either, right? It's not just simple commodities. We're talking about capitalist commodities exchanging for capitalist money, and the exchange rate devaluation of the poorer exporting countries. They just get less money for what they're exporting anyway. So this is also a very major question of sort of like money monopoly, if you like, for the time being. Right. It's a huge factor. I see Linda.
Hi.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether you could make the connection for me between how social labor is represented and what that means for the degree of exploitation.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because it's the heart of what I'm arguing. Okay. So most of the current literature, as I mentioned, I'm an outlier. Okay. I'm slightly an outlaw on this. All right. Most of the current literature use the concept of the monetary equivalent of labor time, which they call the MELT, or the acronym, right? And lambda as a constant. So in Marx's volume one, and there has been a reprise in it, what we're just reading as well, the price of cotton, and how much labor time it goes into spinning it, right? And Marx would say, okay, so workers are getting paid 3 pence an hour, but they're producing new value at the rate of 6 pence an hour. Okay, that's his standard sort of example. So 60-hour week, that's whatever it is, about 15 shillings a week or something like that. Okay. So that's a degree of exploitation, rate of surplus value of 100%. They're producing new value at 6 pence an hour. They're only getting paid 3 pence an hour. That's 3/3. That's 100%. Okay. Now, what I'm saying is that's the first approximation. But what he's now telling us is that workers in one industry, they're getting paid 3 pence an hour. In a different industry, they're also getting paid 3 pence an hour. But if there's fewer workers in one industry, then the profit per worker is higher in the capital intensive industry, right? That's what prices of production does, because it's not a reward to the workers, it's an equal reward to the capital. So the more capital per worker, the more profit per worker. Well, that's the idea. Now, this is really sort of like, it's not the way we've become accustomed to thinking of it, because we see the new value as the product of the worker. Okay. But in a capitalist system and in a different sense, the new value is the product of the capital, right? The capitalist producers are producing commodities for profit. That's what they're doing. And it's that rule which is superimposed on the equality of labor. The equality of capital superimposes on the equality of labor. So that's why I keep saying it's a contradiction. These commodities are both the product of labor and they're the product of capital. But because capital is dominant, its claim to equality is the way the system actually works, right? So that means that workers in some sectors which are capital intensive, there's more profit per worker. Now, how can this be? So surplus labor is represented by more or less profit per worker. The workers don't see this, but it can filter back to them, and they can think, okay, well, we're better workers because there's more profit per worker. But it's not because they're producing more surplus value, it's because the capitals employing them to produce that surplus value are bigger. They have a greater claim on the total surplus value being produced by all capitals. They're proportionately, they have a greater claim. And the points about imperialism are completely right. Okay, so what Marx has got to is the rule of equalization. It's a democracy of capital, basically, equalization of capitals as a class. That's why I think it's almost like abstract capital. Abstract capital is imposed on abstract labor. The rule is not abstract labor, actually. It's abstract capital imposed on abstract labor. So it's not just substance, it's contradiction. Labor gets represented according to the contradiction of capital dominating labor. Okay, if that kind of makes sense, right? The key conceptual importance is, it goes right back to volume 1, chapter 1, is there is a difference between value and exchange value. And this seems very sort of academic and not so interesting, right? But it's the value relation includes its content and its form of representation. Okay. And so it's socially necessary labor time and the money that represents that socially necessary labor time. And this does affect how Marx gets translated, because in German, he generally uses the word darstell, which means represent. Now, represent is not the same as express. Normally, in English translation in Penguin, it's written as express, but it's not. It's a bit like, the shadows on the wall or the actors on the stage. They're representing something. Okay, there's a certain distance between the content and the form. And that distance gets twisted and turned upside down as soon as we understand it's not just labor producing commodities, but it's capital exploiting labor that's producing commodities. So the representation is no longer simple and direct, it's distorted. Okay. It's not a constant. Lambert is wrong. Well, you see, you have to find a point of variation. It's very clear there's a variation between labor time and how it's represented. So where is that point of variation? How does that vary? There is no mechanism of value transfers. I mean, it's as if there's value transfers. I mean, there is in effect, but we're still talking about equal profit. So we're not yet talking about surplus profit. So in that sense, the capitals aren't like filching off each other. They're just getting their, inverted commas, fair share as capitalists, right, of the capital, of the surplus labor. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope it does.
Thank you for that. So my computer fell over. I had to go out and come back in again. So I'm not sure about the recording. How that would have affected the recording. I don't know if you know, John.
The recording is still has gone on because when you dropped out, Andy became automatically host.
Right.
So
okay. So that's not a problem. Okay, great. Phew. Okay, I can see Ed's hand up again. Is it again, or is that?
No, first time from Ed. That's good.
No, it's first time.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Good.
So last time I did this, the microphone didn't work, so I'm assuming that you can hear me.
Yeah.
Smile. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. No, it follows on from what Andy's just said. Is that we're around about slide 11 when you said, Andy, something like that, because you don't have transfers of surplus value, and what you've just said now, it's as if you have transfers of surplus value. I think is a good way of putting it. But you said around about slide 11 that it's like magic because you don't have transfers of surplus value. Isn't it the case, though, that it appears to be a bit like magic because Marx doesn't deal in chapter 9 with any of the social mechanisms through which this so-called transformation takes place? But he deals with them in chapter 10. Now, I know, I can't criticize you for not talking about chapter 10 because you were only going to talk about chapter 8 and chapter 9 anyway. So this is fair enough. And it'd be too much. But he does go into the social mechanisms, doesn't he? In chapter 10, through which these transformations do take place. And it seems to me that chapter 9 is kind of just a kind of algebraic exercise where he says, well, let's imagine that there is a general rate of profit. What would it look like in terms of numbers? And in chapter 10, he starts to go through the mechanisms whereby you would actually get the kind of movement of social labor in the form of capital between spheres of production, in which I think the markups that you talk about, and I think this is a very productive way to look at it, the markups that capitals don't ultimately choose their markups, do they? They get the markups are imposed on. They try to choose their markups, but ultimately the markups get imposed on them through competition. And just to finish the point, when you say there's a distinction between how capitals compete on the commodity markets and how capitals compete in the capital market, and isn't it the case really that it's not so much that capitals compete amongst themselves on the capital market for capital, but that capital itself selects the capitals on the capital market in terms of the highest rate of return that it thinks that it can get. So both competitions take place, but it's almost like capital competing with itself for capitals rather than capitals competing amongst themselves for capital on the capital market. And that's the mechanism through which markups get imposed, prices of production get imposed, and there are social mechanisms in relation to supply and demand and so on. The Marxist doesn't talk about in chapter 9. And it's a pity sometimes that people who dislike the so-called transformation problem focus all their attention on chapter 9, because really I think the key to a lot of these things is in chapter 10. And in a sense, the chapter 10 is actually a theoretically richer contribution to this kind of discussion than what you get in chapter 9.
Wow, that's really helpful. I mean, to be honest, I haven't reread chapter 10 in preparing this, so your points very, very, very well may hold, right? What I've been concentrating on another thing, which is how much of the notebooks gets into the version, right? And this is open question. I don't know the answer, but it might well be that it does filter through into chapter 10. But what I've found is that Marx writes a lot of his later notebook on this. He starts off with a different example, basically, than one he gives in chapter 9. And what he starts off with is a total social capital, which is represented by one sort of case, one capital, right? And he says, okay, so I will have the turnover being the same now. A unity, right? And it's very interesting, his example, because it takes you much more quickly into markup. And what he also writes about is, you see, I think it's misleading to think that there's a starting point where prices of production are not already set. And so there's a lot of writers say, well, okay, capital moves. I mean, famously, I think Sweezy did and others, right? Even iteratively to go from one state to another. But that state is already the rule. And I think we completely agree on that. Yeah, well, let's read chapter 10. That's very helpful. But what I would also say is, just on the sort of latter point, it's probably just the levels of abstraction thing. I mean, I am thinking this in terms of industrial capitals, right? If you like, attracting money capital, going to the bank, basically trying to get more money, or their shareholders. So, but you're right, another level of abstraction. This is capital. This is capital moving in the way it moves, right? Moving into higher profit rate areas, that's for sure. I mean, they often get confused is what I'm trying to say. And I found Tran's book, which is only available in French, very helpful on this. I think Pierre Salamar and Tran Hai Hack really help my understanding of this, because what they say is, yeah, capital does move between sectors, but this is not to form prices of production, but this is on the basis of prices of production, which I think is exactly another way of saying what you were saying. So yeah, good.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. So you mentioned Sweezer there, didn't you? I know he's got this idea of Marx's method of successive approximation. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. But I can see Walter's hand up, so let Walter ask his question, then you can perhaps respond to both of us. Oh, and John as well, but Walter first.
Well, first of all, Ed mentioned something in chapter 10. If you look ahead to chapter 12, Marx actually says that this that I was going to put it in the chat, but I guess the chat is not operative, and it's kind of long, so I don't really want to read it. But there's a section where he says that the capitalists really do not um, shift capital back and forth between sectors to equalize the rate of profit. But he essentially says that the capitalists are aware of their cost price and they're aware of the general rate of profit, and they just work it out from that. They estimate what their prices should be on the basis of an anticipated average rate of profit.
That's great. That's good. I also, yeah, confirms that.
As a second point, I don't want to disrupt this. I have a very tangential comment about state of imperialism before we close off. So I don't want to do it now to disrupt the discussion.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Walter. So, John.
Yeah, just wanted to ask a question about earlier on. You were saying that there are no transactions that take place that can ensure an equalization of the rate of profit between sectors. So, but I just wonder. I mean, the way I've thought about it, and everything will have to be rethought after this lecture. But the way I've thought about it is that firms exchange. There is the distinction between value generated and value captured. Value generated and value captured is the subtitle of that little article, GDP Illusion. And so the exchange that takes place, there is only one exchange that takes place, and that is when they actually realize the value of the commodities they produce in a sum of money. And that is a transaction, that is an exchange with total social capital. That's the way I've understood it. Now that includes all of this, but it also includes concretely the actual conditions of imperialism and the different labour regimes and everything else. Everything is included in that. But it is fundamentally a transaction. That's the only real transaction. And so it does seem to me that transactions are actually part of the way that this actually appears. So basically the question is total social capital. Surely that explains a lot of, or it's a core concept which right at the center of what you've been arguing in this lecture.
Yeah, so okay, Tony can correct me on this, I'm sure, right? But there is an issue of the general, particular, and singular, right? Because there is no pool. I mean, almost all the literature says that there are transactions, payments into a pool, or suggest that, and then the payments out of a pool, number one. Or they also say that the way that prices of production are formed are by movements of capital between sectors, right? And I'm saying neither of those two things take place. We have to explain price of production on a different basis, right? And I think that's what I'm saying. So it shifts the point to between value generated and value captured. It's how is value represented, right? That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay. And before we get to imperialism, value is represented differently in Marx's solution according to the organic composition of capital. Okay. And then all the points that Walter and Ed were making, that's a mechanism. Now there is a point about transactions, of course there is, but Marx makes the point earlier on in volume 3 that if the cost plus profit basis does not equal value, in other words, if one capitalist sells their commodities at a profit which is less than the full value, then the gainer is the buyer, and that's true. And in that sense, the point holds, and this is the basis also of unequal exchange. I mean, the surplus labor partly gets captured by the selling capitalist and partly in effect gets captured by the buyer, and that is certainly the case. It needs more development, but the core idea is there in Marx, I think. What I'm trying to argue against is the idea that there's one state of simple value which then a whole load of transactions take place, and we end up with prices of production, right? Which I do think is the dominant sort of explanation, hegemonic explanation, actually. And I'm contesting it.
Okay, thank you for that, John. So we're running out of time, but Ed I've been talking to Ed in the chat, and so I'm surprised that Walter, when he said that the chat wasn't working for him, but Ed wants to know what page number in chapter 12 you were referring to in your earlier remark, Walter. So could you tell us that before we wind up?
I can't tell you the page number because I'm reading the quote from a different translation.
Oh dear,
it's in
right.
the third section of chapter 12.
What section in chapter 12?
The third.
Thank you. I will find it.
Okay, Ed, yeah, right. Well, I think we have in fact run out of. Oh, you got your hand up. I can see. Go on.
Before we close, I think it's important to point out, since we're talking about imperialism, we are at the moment historically at a major turning point in imperialism. The American century that began with World War II is ended. The New World Order that the first George Bush presidents declared when the Soviet Union collapsed is ended. The Iran war is the tipping point, and no longer is the U.S. the protector of, or the champion over its rival imperialists, the protector of the lesser countries. It's all gone. I could go into that at greater length, but I think we should just be aware the world is changing as we speak. And I think I can't tell what it'll become, but it looks like we're entering a much more dangerous period, even, than we've been in.
On which cheery note, John, do you want to respond? Sorry, Andy, do you want to respond to that? Or...
Yeah, well, I think we should be discussing what's really going on. I mean, I have just circulated a couple of articles from the Financial Times about this. I mean, we do want to bring the political economy into the war, I think, is really the thing, you know. And I mean, basically, I think, unfortunately, the dying horse is still kicking, and it's kicking very, very cruelly.
It's the World War III world. We've now entered. No, the gates of hell have been opened in Gaza, right? The gates of hell have been opened.
The gates of hell were opened in Sri Lanka, in my view. The genocide in Sri Lanka is not known, but it was already opened. But let me, you see, this is part of the discussion, right? 250,000 people were killed in Central America. I mean, imperialism has been merciless in every point of its history. And
well, when they talk about destroying the civilian infrastructure, there wasn't a single brick standing on another brick in North Korea. You know, they've systematically destroyed civilian infrastructure in Iraq and
exactly. Well, Wiley's got his hand up. I don't know if we want to take Wiley.
No. My only comment is I'm 100% in agreement with Walter on that. That's all I have to say. I feel the same way. I don't know what the hell is going to happen tomorrow, but something's going on. That's all.
We've sent you an emissary of peace.
We
call him Charles.
So
what's going on?
It's just drawn to my attention the fact that the chat is working in the sense that participants can chat to the co-host, but it's not working in the sense that they can post to everybody. So I don't know why that is. I've no idea. I'm not sufficiently au fait with the technology, but if that's a recurrent issue, we'll try and sort that out for next time, certainly, because that's not ideal, is it? Right, well, we really have run out of time, I'm afraid. So, as always, it got really interesting right at the end in the discussion, but sod's law, isn't it? So my apologies for having to cut everything short.